In just 57 seconds, a black man stood alone in front of the United States Congress, the same room that has silenced the most powerful voices, and turned the tables without raising his own. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is the moment that made the whole world hold its breath. The morning sky over Washington, D.C. was unusually heavy, cloaked in a cold gray mist that clung to the domed silhouette of the Capitol like a warning. Beneath its neoclassical pillars, a different kind of storm was forming, not one of wind or rain, but of microphones, camera flashes, and sharpened agendas. Inside the Capitol building, the marble halls echoed with quick footsteps and hushed conversations. Staffers rushed by with thick folders under their arms, earbuds in, eyes locked on their phones. The buzz was undeniable. Something big was coming. Everyone could feel it. Something volatile. And at the center of it stood one name whispered with both admiration and dread. Jasmine Crockett. The congresswoman from Texas, young, brilliant, and ruthlessly eloquent, was preparing to deliver what the media had already dubbed the most aggressive congressional statement on African policy in over a decade. Her target was not a dictator in the traditional sense, but a new kind of adversary, one who had become a symbol for defiance in Africa, a man who had dared to say no to the usual powers, a man named Ibrahim Traoré. Crockett stood in her private office, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her tailored navy suit was flawless, but her eyes burned with something deeper, conviction laced with a tinge of anxiety. She had rehearsed this speech 100 times, but today wasn't about perfect lines. Today was about making history. Today she would unveil what she claimed were truths the world needed to hear, secrets that, once exposed, would shatter the illusion of Traoré's so-called revolution. Outside, reporters swarmed the Capitol steps, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Headlines flickered across tablets and phones. Congresswoman Crockett set to expose. West African leader is Traoré, a freedom fighter or a strategically packaged tyrant. Satellite trucks parked along the street. Cameramen adjusted lenses. Commentators reviewed notes. There was blood in the water, and every media outlet wanted the first drop. In the hallway outside the hearing room, the air was taut. Crockett walked slowly down the corridor, each step echoing under the vaulted ceiling. She was flanked by two aides, both silent, both visibly tense. One of them handed her a final copy of her speech. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. Every word was already burned into her memory. The hearing room itself was stark, cold, and bright. Rows of seats lined the chamber, already filled with diplomats, defense analysts, NGO observers, and more journalists than usually allowed. Cameras buzzed softly, waiting. The chair at the head of the long desk sat empty, reserved for the man who had flown in from the other side of the world to face these accusations. Ibrahim Traoré, but he was not there yet. Whispers filled the room. Some scoffed at Crockett's boldness. Others admired her courage, and some simply feared what would happen next. It was no longer just about one leader. This had become a battle between narratives, between worldviews. Behind closed doors, in a secure room 1 floor above, Traoré was being briefed by a translator and a legal advisor. He wore his military uniform, simple, dark olive green, no medals. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost unnervingly so. He had come not to beg, not to plead, but to listen. Downstairs, the gavel slammed once, loud and final. The chairman entered. Crockett took her seat. Cameras zoomed in. The audience went silent. The door behind the witness podium opened, and every head turned. But it wasn't Traoré. Not yet. It was one of the clerk's staff, handing a sealed envelope to the chairman with quiet urgency. The chairman raised an eyebrow, opened the envelope, and scanned its contents. He froze. Just for a second. Just long enough. Long enough for something to shift in the room. Long enough for Jasmine Crockett to sense that this morning might not go entirely according to plan. And far away, in a quiet apartment in Georgetown, an elderly woman opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered briefly over the keyboard before she hit send. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and the storm was only just beginning. To the Western press, he was a problem wrapped in a uniform, a disruption, a threat cloaked in revolutionary rhetoric. In headlines and think pieces, they called him everything but legitimate, a military strongman, a populist with a dangerous smile, a symbol of the growing wave of anti-Western sentiment sweeping across Africa like wildfire. Yet to the people of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré was something else entirely. They called him Le Capitaine du Peuple, the people's captain, and for many, he was more than a president. He was the answer to a long, bitter question they had carried for generations. Who would finally stand up to those who had always spoken over them? Who would say no when the world expected yes? Who would protect the land not for investors, but for children who tilled it with calloused hands and dreams too often deferred? It was not always this way. Years before the cameras, before the portraits in government buildings, before the accusations and the applause, Ibrahim was just a young cadet with a quiet voice and restless eyes. Born in 1988 in the dusty northern town of Bondoukoui, he grew up under skies scorched by sun and governments scorched by corruption. His father was a mechanic. His mother sold vegetables at the roadside. Neither of them had ever stepped foot inside a palace. But both taught him about dignity, not through speeches, but through living. In school, he was known for his silence. The kind of silence that listens, that watches, not out of fear, but calculation. Teachers noticed he rarely spoke unless the moment demanded it. When he did, the room listened. He joined the military academy at a time when many saw it as the only path to survival. He saw it as something more, a place to learn structure, strategy, discipline. He was not the loudest, nor the most decorated, but when it came to field work, to commanding under pressure, few could match his calm. By the time he was 30, he had served across the Sahel. He had seen villages torn apart by extremists, soldiers sent to fight without boots or bullets, foreign contractors escorted through towns with more power than any elected official. He did not forget these things. He remembered them, quietly, precisely. He kept a notebook, names, dates, patterns. It was in 2022 that the breaking point came. The government at the time, paralyzed by indecision and riddled with internal fractures, failed again to respond to a deadly attack on civilians in the north. Traoré, then just a captain, was stationed near the region. He saw the aftermath. He saw the graves dug too fast. He saw mothers holding photographs instead of sons. Something in him shifted. Within weeks, he and a coalition of junior officers staged what they called an act of correction. Not a coup, they insisted, but a reclamation, a resetting. The world called it a power grab. They called it a rescue, and perhaps it was both. When he addressed the nation for the first time, there were no grand slogans, no promises of eternal glory. He spoke with a gravel-tinged voice, measured and steady, to a camera that flickered slightly under the weight of his words. We will no longer be spectators to our own suffering. The world was not ready for Ibrahim Traoré. His uniform, his youth, his refusal to follow the usual diplomatic script unnerved seasoned statesmen. He declined photo ops. He skipped receptions. He gave interviews only when necessary, and when he did, he rarely said what the interviewers wanted to hear. But inside Burkina Faso, hope surged. Markets named drinks after him. Students wore his image on T-shirts. Artists painted murals of him, rifles slung low, eyes fixed ahead. They did not worship him. They believed in what he represented. For once, someone was not pretending to fix things while signing deals in back rooms. Back in the hearing room, as cameras adjusted and whispers circled Jasmine Crockett's poised figure, few understood the man they were preparing to dissect. To them, he was just another name on a growing list of inconvenient leaders. But for millions in West Africa, Ibrahim Traoré was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, the tide could be turned. And in the silence before the gavel called the room to order, that tide was already rising. Quiet, steady, inevitable. It was past midnight when the doors to the penthouse conference room closed behind Jasmine Crockett. The city outside was bathed in amber light, windows blinking like distant stars. Inside, the mood was far less celestial. Leather chairs circled a long oak table, the air thick with expensive cologne and practiced smiles. The room belonged to one of the most influential lobbying firms in D.C., though its name rarely appeared in print. Those who met there preferred shadows over headlines. 7 people were present, 3 in tailored suits, 2 in diplomatic uniform, 1 in a crisp dress with a legal pad open in front of her, and Jasmine Crockett seated at the head of the table, spine straight, eyes alert. The man to her left, a silver-haired consultant with a voice like sandpaper, slid a folder toward her without ceremony. "We need to frame this right. Keep the narrative focused. Human rights, instability, national interest." She opened the folder, satellite images, mining data, internal government memos from Burkina Faso, and beneath it all, a contract, or rather, the remains of one. A lucrative mineral extraction agreement once held by a Western conglomerate, now suspended indefinitely after Traoré's administration nationalized key industries. This isn't just about him, is it? The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the diplomats leaned forward, fingers steepled. "He's setting a precedent. If Burkina Faso gets away with this, others will follow. Mali, Niger, Guinea. The entire region could turn their backs on foreign investment. That's billions lost overnight." Crockett listened. She knew this language. It was the language of stakes and leverage. The moral framing was always a convenient dressing. The real engine was access, control, and profit. They wanted the contract back, and they needed the narrative to bend in their favor. Your speech can't sound like a takedown. Make it surgical, subtle, just enough to raise eyebrows in Brussels and London, just enough to open the door for sanctions or pressure. Let the markets do the rest. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, the Capitol dome still faintly visible in the distance. She had built her career on fiery rhetoric and firm principles. But in this city, fire could be shaped into light or smoke, and principles, when properly negotiated, could be redefined as pragmatism. Finally, she stood, slid the folder back across the table. Her voice was even, steady. It will be done as she walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking softly on polished stone. No one followed. They didn't need to. The message was delivered. The machinery was already turning. Tomorrow, the world will hear the truth. The hearing room had always been a cold place. Sterile, almost clinical in its symmetry. White walls broken only by muted flags and polished wood. But today, the chill was different. Not from the air conditioning, but from something invisible and electric. It hummed beneath the seats, danced along the rows of attendees, settled like a weight between the ceiling lights and the silence below. Cameras lined the walls, their red lights blinking steadily. Journalists occupied the first 2 rows with pens poised and brows drawn tight. Analysts from think tanks shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering into phones and trading glances. Diplomats sat behind folded arms, expressions blank but eyes calculating. The world had gathered here, under one roof, not to witness a debate, but a reckoning. At the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré sat in dignified stillness. He wore no suit, no silk tie, just his military uniform, dark olive, simple, worn, no medals, no flourishes. His face was composed, unreadable. His eyes, however, scanned the room like they had done 100 battlefields before. Not with fear, not with pride, but with a soldier's understanding that he was surrounded not by enemies, but by weapons dressed in civility. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett. Her presence was sharp, calculated. The navy blue jacket fit like armor, Her expression was poised, her back straight, hands folded calmly in front of her, but her eyes betrayed something more volatile, a spark that burned hotter than ambition. This was her moment. She had been waiting for this since the folder slid across the table last night. The chairman cleared his throat. The gavel struck once, not loudly, just enough to shift the room from anxious murmur to complete silence. This hearing will now come to order as the formalities were read. No one truly listened. The tension had already outpaced the protocol. What mattered now were the next few minutes. A single speech, a carefully crafted blow. And how a man from a continent too often spoken for would respond when spoken over once again. Crockett was given the floor. She rose slowly, deliberately, adjusted the microphone, then looked directly at Traoré, not with a smile, but something more precise, a scalpel disguised as a gaze. Mr. Chairman, esteemed colleagues, and to our guest from Burkina Faso. Her voice, soft at first, stretched into the space like smoke. There was no shaking in it, no falter, only a growing blade beneath every syllable. I speak today not to condemn a man, but to question a myth that has captured headlines, seduced sympathizers, and cloaked repression in the language of revolution. Murmurs stirred, but she continued without pause. We are told that President Ibrahim Traoré represents a new kind of Africa, one that stands proud and free. But what freedom exists when journalists vanish? When opposition is silenced? When elections become ceremonies instead of choices, cameras zoomed in. Traoré did not move. His hands rested calmly on the desk, but his eyes had narrowed just slightly. Enough for those who watch closely to know he was listening. Crockett stepped forward. In the name of sovereignty, this administration has nationalized resources, expelled foreign partners, and disregarded constitutional norms. And while these moves may sound righteous to some, let us be clear, they have left families hungry, schools without books, hospitals without power. She looked at the audience now, direct, fierce, and while some call this courage, I call it control, not liberation, subjugation, a populist script rewritten with military ink. Silence fell again, heavier now. Some in the room looked toward Traoré, waiting for a shift, a reaction, a word. But he remained exactly as he was, as if the words floated around him without touching skin. Crockett turned back toward the chairman, voice steady, unwavering. Let the record show that this is not about politics. It is about principle. It is about ensuring that in a world obsessed with narratives, we do not forget the value of truth. She sat down slowly, her final sentence still ringing in the room like a distant echo. The hearing continued, but nothing else was really heard. Everyone now looked to one place, to the man who had yet to speak, to the man they had come to crush. Crockett's opening remarks had set the tone, but they were only the first blade in a series of precise incisions, each one deeper than the last. This was not a speech. It was surgery, and the room was the operating theater. She adjusted her papers, then leaned into the microphone again, her tone shifting, not louder, but colder. Let us examine what democracy means when it is practiced at gunpoint. On the large screen behind her, a slide appeared, grainy footage of soldiers standing in a village square, rifles visible, faces blurred. According to Crockett, this was a district in the northern province of Burkina Faso, taken just days after a group of local journalists disappeared. No trial, no explanation, just silence and soldiers. Since the transition of power, over a dozen independent media outlets have been suspended, reporters intimidated, editorial boards disbanded, civil society reduced to whispers. Another image, a newspaper office in ruins, a burned printing press. Beside it, the caption, "Once the voice of the people, now a memory." She paused only briefly before continuing. The narrative being sold to the world is one of emancipation, A sovereign people reclaiming their destiny? But what kind of destiny is it when press freedom is treated like a foreign concept? When the radio waves fall quiet and public gatherings become criminal acts, Traoré remained motionless, his fingers still interlocked, his gaze unwavering. But there was something in the set of his jaw now, a tension not yet released. Crockett moved to her next slide. In the past year alone, political opposition in Burkina Faso has faced systematic dismantling, detentions without charges, mysterious disappearances, laws rewritten overnight under the banner of national security. The screen shifted again. A document appeared, redacted in parts. A list of names. Individuals flagged as threats to national cohesion. The implication was clear. Traoré's government was not just silencing critics, it was documenting them, categorizing dissent as danger. And what of the military itself? She turned, this time facing the row of diplomats at the back of the chamber. This administration came to power through a military action. Since then, civilian oversight has eroded, and the lines between governance and command have blurred. Ministers appointed without public input, decisions made behind closed doors. It is no longer governance by representation. It is governance by rank. The words were sharp, rehearsed to leave bruises. Even those sympathetic to Traoré began to shift uncomfortably, not because they agreed, but because the silence on his end made the accusations feel heavier by the minute. Crockett returned to her seat, eyes scanning the room. Still, Traoré said nothing. The chairman cleared his throat. A diplomat scribbled something in the margins of his folder. A CNN correspondent leaned closer to her producer and whispered, audible only to those nearby. Why isn't he responding? A second reporter replied softly. Maybe he has no defense. That possibility hung in the room like smoke. Slow, lingering, toxic. Some in the audience began to lean away from their initial impressions. The man they had seen in murals and protest chants suddenly seemed too quiet, too composed. Was it dignity or was it evasion? More slides followed, presented by staffers invited by Crockett, statistics, charts, testimonies from exiled journalists. Every new detail layered more weight onto the silence. Each allegation another brick in a wall being built around Traoré's reputation. A wall no words had yet tried to scale. He sat through all of it without flinching, no gestures, no side comments to aides, just stillness, as if absorbing the blows with intention, or restraint, or both. The chairman eventually raised his hand, preparing to shift the session toward direct questioning, but before he could, one of the aides handed him a note. His brow furrowed. The cameras caught none of it, just the pause, the faint flicker of disruption. But in that pause, something subtle began to shift. Traoré looked up, not just at the chairman, but at Jasmine Crockett, and though his lips remained sealed, his gaze said something louder than any microphone ever could. I hear you, but I am not here to argue. Not yet. The silence had become unbearable. Not the polite kind that followed a speaker's final words, but the kind that grew thicker with every passing second, pressing against walls and lungs alike. Even the lights overhead seemed to dim beneath the weight of it. The hearing chamber felt like a room that had run out of breath. Crockett sat back, her hands folded neatly before her, lips pursed in studied control. She had delivered every line with precision, her evidence laid bare, her message unmistakable. If there was a response from Traoré, it had yet to arrive, but she knew the effect of silence. Sometimes not answering was the answer itself, and silence under accusation often looked like guilt. The chairman leaned toward his microphone, ready to continue the session, but just as he opened his mouth, a staffer moved swiftly across the room, approaching the elevated desk with a sealed envelope in hand. It was delivered quietly, without comment. The chairman took it with a flicker of surprise, eyes narrowing as he read the label. He opened the envelope. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at the pages inside. He read quickly, once, then again, his expression tightening. The chairman's voice, when it returned, carried a new edge. We are temporarily suspending the proceedings. This committee has just received new material that could affect the integrity of this session. The words struck like a match in a gas-filled room. Heads turned, phones were lifted, journalists whispered, then stopped whispering altogether. The room had been tense before. Now it bristled with confusion and latent urgency. What new material? Who sent it? Why now? Crockett's brow furrowed. She leaned toward her aide, who shrugged, equally unaware. Across the table, Traoré remained still, but his gaze shifted slightly. He too was watching. The chairman held up the first page in the envelope, visible now to those near the front row. And though the words on the page were too small to read, the signature printed clearly at the bottom was not Professor Margaret Holloway. In the span of a heartbeat, everything changed. The name rippled through the chamber like a current. Crockett went pale. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. She knew that name, intimately, not just as a public figure or academic, but as a mentor, a former teacher, a guiding voice in her earliest political awakening. The cameras, sensing the shift, zoomed in on her face, on the envelope, on the chairman, but no one moved, because in that moment, no one quite understood what had just arrived in the room, only that something had broken, and it was not Traoré's silence. The name echoed in Jasmine Crockett's mind like the faint toll of a bell buried beneath years of ambition. Professor Margaret Holloway. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her vision sharpened, not out of clarity, but the jarring focus of disbelief. Around her, the room whispered and shifted, but none of it reached her ears. She was no longer in the chamber, no longer seated beneath the glow of congressional spotlights. She was 23 again, standing outside a book-lined office in Cambridge, holding a thesis proposal trembling slightly in her hands. Professor Holloway had been more than a supervisor. She had been a compass, a woman of quiet intellect and piercing questions. Holloway had never told her students what to think. She made them uncomfortable instead, challenged their easy answers, broke apart their rehearsed ideals. Crockett had admired her then, feared her even, but it was that same uncompromising presence that pushed her forward, helped shape her voice, and sharpened her thinking into the weapon it had become. They had parted on warm terms after Crockett's graduation, a polite hug, a final handwritten note of encouragement, and a promise to stay in touch that neither had kept. Time had its own gravity. Ambition even more so. So why now? Why here across the room? Traoré's eyes remained calm, but Crockett felt something tighten in her chest. The professor had never sought power. She had avoided the spotlight, written books that challenged the status quo but never made bestseller lists. She had always stood just to the side of politics, near enough to see clearly, far enough to speak without fear. For her to insert herself into this hearing, publicly, and at this exact moment, it wasn't chance. It was choice. And then a second memory surfaced, one Crockett had not recalled in years. A framed photo on Holloway's office shelf, a group of international students standing in front of an old stone university in southern France. Among them, a young man in uniform, sharp eyes, upright posture, unfamiliar uniform. She had once asked about him. That's Ibrahim, bright, quiet, fiercely observant. One of the most principled I ever taught. She had dismissed the name at the time. Just another student in Holloway's long list of protégés. She hadn't made the connection, not until now. Professor Holloway had taught them both. Two students, two paths, and now, two opponents. The irony burned. The chairman whispered something to his aides. A copy of the letter was already being prepared for the committee members. Crockett straightened in her seat, face steady, but her mind racing. What did the letter say? Was it personal, political, a defense of Traoré, a condemnation of her? She imagined Holloway, seated somewhere with her old-fashioned glasses and tea left to go cold, composing every word carefully, measured, ethical, sharp as ever. A voice that once guided, now returning not to support, but to challenge. The timing was surgical. The blow had landed. And suddenly, Crockett understood that this hearing was no longer entirely hers to control. There was another hand now, moving pieces on the board. Not a partisan, not a diplomat, but a woman who had once taught her how to see through illusion and was now reminding her that truth, once abandoned, always finds its way back. The letter was placed delicately on the desk before the chairman, printed on cream-colored paper, the kind that seemed to carry more weight than the standard crisp white of government correspondence. Its contents were already being scanned, photocopied, and distributed across the committee. As aides moved swiftly between desks, whispers rippled across the room like wind through dry grass. One copy was placed directly in front of Jasmine Crockett. She did not touch it. Her eyes traced the letterhead, instantly familiar. She had seen it on dozens of recommendation letters during her years at university. Only now, its presence felt colder, heavier. The chairman cleared his throat again and began to read aloud. This is a letter submitted to the committee by Professor Margaret Holloway, currently of Cambridge University, formerly of the American Institute for Ethics and Global Policy. The author has taught both the witness and the questioning representative in separate academic programs. The room stilled once more. I write not to defend a man, but to defend the truth. The words landed like a soft hammer, gentle in tone, unforgiving in impact. Ibrahim Traoré and Jasmine Crockett both passed through my classroom. Though at different times and in very different worlds, I taught them not only political theory, but the ethics of leadership, the weight of power, and the moral burden that comes with shaping narratives for others to follow. Traoré was quiet, observant, and deliberate. Crockett was sharp, passionate, and unafraid to challenge. I was proud of them both. But pride can become pain when the past returns with a different face. I have reviewed the materials related to this hearing and feel a responsibility to speak. The chairman hesitated briefly before reading the next lines. One of them has become a voice for the voiceless. The other, I fear, has become a tool for the powerful. A murmur surged through the chamber. The camera zoomed. Crockett's eyes remained on the page, motionless. Her hands, however, had curled slightly into the arms of her chair. I do not write this lightly, but when principle is sacrificed on the altar of influence, it is the duty of those who once taught integrity to speak. Attached to this letter are documents that have recently come into my possession. They include internal communications between Representative Crockett's office and a series of lobbyists affiliated with Northstone Resources, a consortium with ongoing mineral interests in West Africa. Another packet of documents was passed down, black and white, header, stamped dates, email chains. Some highlighted, a brief reference to a political campaign contribution buried inside one message, promises of increased visibility, mentions of mining rights suspended under Traoré's administration. One email read, "Once the hearing lands, the board is confident sanctions can be leveraged to reopen negotiations." Another, "We'll push the media angle harder this week. She's rehearsed the lines. Africa needs structure. Investors need confidence. The language will sell itself." The words were cold, unfiltered, corporate. The professor's letter continued, "I do not make legal accusations. That is not my place, but I do raise a moral question. When does advocacy become manipulation? When does truth serve power rather than challenge it? To remain silent would be to watch a student forget the lessons she once held dear. I know Jasmine. I know her mind. I also know when that mind is being shaped by forces it once vowed to resist." The chairman folded the letter quietly. No final flourish. No declaration of judgment. Just stillness. All eyes were now on Crockett. For the first time since the hearing began, she looked away from her notes, away from Traoré. She looked down and across from her. Traoré shifted slightly in his chair. Not a smirk, not a smile, but something resolute in his presence. He had not needed to defend himself. Not yet. The defense had arrived in words not his own. from a voice older than the noise in the room. And those words burned. The chairman lowered the final page of the letter. No one spoke. The hearing room, moments ago bristling with controlled rhetoric and polished ambition, now sat in a stunned and uneasy quiet. The air had shifted, no longer tense, but fractured. One of the aides stepped forward and leaned in. The chairman nodded, then lifted the microphone again, voice measured but flat. This session will be adjourned temporarily. The committee requires time to review the submitted materials. The gavel struck once. It was not loud, but it landed like a detonation. The room reacted instantly. Reporters scrambled, papers rustled, phones lit up as texts and headlines flooded out from the chamber. Outside, cameras turned toward the exits, preparing for statements. Inside, the spell of authority broke apart. Crockett stood too quickly. Her chair scraped loudly across the floor, the sound sharp, awkward. She reached for her notes, only to hesitate, as if suddenly unsure of what was worth holding on to. Her aide whispered something in her ear, but she waved him off. Her composure, so carefully sculpted through months of planning, began to fray at the edges. I want the opportunity to respond. She directed the sentence toward the chairman, but he was already conferring with another staffer. His back turned. She raised her voice again, this time louder. These documents lack context. I should be allowed to clarify the timeline. No one answered. Across the room, Traoré remained seated. The same stillness, the same hands resting quietly. He had not shifted, not leaned forward, not raised his voice in protest or defense. Through an entire storm of accusation, implication, and revelation, he had done the most disarming thing possible. He had waited. Crockett moved toward him now, not directly, but just enough to break the invisible line of neutrality. Her voice lowered, not quite a whisper, but urgent. You knew she'd send it. You planned this. He looked at her, not a word, not a blink of satisfaction, only a gaze, steady, unfazed, patient. It was not the look of a man who had won something. It was the look of a man who knew that some truths do not need defending, only enduring. Outside the hearing chamber, the media waited like a tide pressing against glass. As Crockett emerged, microphones surrounded her. Flashbulbs burst. Questions fired. Congresswoman, were you aware of the funding links? Did you speak to the Northstone board directly? Are you resigning from the Foreign Affairs Committee? She pushed through the noise, jaw clenched. No answers given. Her carefully curated moment had splintered under a truth spoken by someone who no longer owed her silence. Inside the chamber, Traoré stood at last. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, glanced once toward the rows of now empty chairs, then walked out the side door without a single escort. He had come prepared for battle, but victory had come quietly, and he had not spoken a single word. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline of Washington, the story had already broken in 4 languages and 3 continents. What began as a tightly controlled congressional hearing had erupted into a full-scale international spectacle. From the newsroom floors of Manhattan to open cafes in Accra, from press boxes in Paris to digital command centers in Johannesburg, the headlines moved like a current no one could stop. CNN opened its primetime hour with a lead banner stretched across the screen in bold letters. Congresswoman accused of collusion in high-stakes Africa. Hearing. A grainy freeze frame of Jasmine Crockett, mid-sentence, appeared beside the anchor's shoulder. Her face caught in a moment of tension she could no longer edit. Across the Atlantic, the BBC ran a panel of African scholars and European analysts dissecting the professor's letter line by line. The broadcast made room for nuance, but the questions came sharp and fast. What does this say about the West's role in African governance? Was this hearing about justice or control? Al Jazeera ran live footage of protests forming in Burkina Faso's capital. Crowds gathering in the streets, waving national flags and homemade posters bearing Traoré's face beneath slogans scribbled in permanent marker. France 24 broke down the leaked emails shown in the letter attachments, mapping the corporate relationships between Crockett's campaign donors and mining contracts suspended under Traoré's government. The connections were not illegal, but they were no longer invisible. Online, the chaos unfolded even faster. By midnight, Twitter was ablaze. Two hashtags surged above all others: Justice for Traoré and Expose the Truth. They trended globally within hours. Memes began to circulate. Side-by-side photos of Crockett in her hearing chair and Holloway's signature beneath the explosive letter. A quote pulled from the professor's words lit up feeds around the world. One became a voice for the oppressed. The other, I fear, has become a tool for the powerful comment threads turned into battlegrounds. On one side, thousands called for Crockett to resign, accusing her of moral compromise and political theater. On the other, a smaller but fervent group of supporters insisted that she was being punished for doing the right thing, for asking hard questions, for challenging a man they still believed to be dangerous. News outlets pulled old clips of Traoré speaking at African summits, juxtaposed with Crockett's remarks at campaign rallies. Opinion pieces poured in, many of them headlined with cautious ambiguity, but framed with unmistakable undertones. "The face of a new Africa," said one. "The cost of speaking against a strongman," said another. The split was not clean. It rarely was. Some criticized Traoré's silence as a political stunt, a carefully orchestrated image of stoic resistance designed to evade scrutiny. Others praised it as strategic dignity, the dignity of a man unwilling to dignify falsehoods with frantic rebuttal. He had let the truth arrive in someone else's voice, and that, for many, said more than any defense he could have given. Meanwhile, inside political circles, phones rang incessantly, donor networks whispered, congressional staffers drafted statements, most of them containing the same cautious line: "We are closely monitoring the situation." The Foreign Affairs Committee was flooded with calls for an internal review. An ethics panel quietly began to request interviews. Crockett, once the rising voice of youthful defiance, was now a name wrapped in uncertainty. She released a brief statement through her office, citing misrepresentation and reaffirming her commitment to democratic principles. But it was too late to control the narrative. The court of public opinion had already called itself into session, and it did not adjourn. Across the world, people leaned closer to their screens, searching through the noise for something real. A line of truth that did not require loyalty to believe. A reason to trust, or a reason to question everything. In Ouagadougou, the streets did not wait for permission. By morning, the city moved with a different rhythm. It began with murmurs. Messages passed through community radios, whispered in markets, shared beneath the soft rustle of mosquito nets before sunrise. And then it gathered speed, footsteps in the dust, voices rising together, drums, flags, faces painted with the national colors of red, green, and gold. By midday, the boulevards overflowed. They came in waves: farmers in worn sandals, students in white uniforms, nurses in faded blue scrubs who had just come off night shifts but refused to go home. Their chants were not violent. Their eyes were not afraid. They carried portraits of Ibrahim Traoré, some drawn by hand, others printed on cotton banners, and above their heads they held signs, some in French, some in native dialects, and some in bold, clear English. "We see him, we chose him, we stand by him." To outsiders, the protests might have looked like a show of nationalism, but inside the crowd, there was something deeper. This was not just about one man. It was about a line being drawn, a declaration long delayed, now voiced without hesitation. In the capital's central plaza, an old woman stood on a wooden crate, her voice amplified only by the silence that followed. We have seen many men wear uniforms. Some brought pain, some brought fear, but this one brought his hands to the soil before he brought them to the podium. This one came to listen first across the continent. The message echoed in Ghana. President Kwame Asante released a statement before dawn, standing before a simple backdrop with no flag, only his words. He spoke calmly, but firmly. Let us be clear. Africa does not belong to committees in distant chambers. Sovereignty cannot be awarded like a grant. It is lived, it is paid for. And it is ours in Mali, where Traoré had gained quiet respect for his rejection of neo-colonial pressure. The interim government released a message of solidarity. No African leader should be made to answer for independence as if it were a crime in South Africa, where media debates were already ignited. President Sibusiso Mbeki took to the airwaves. His tone was more measured, more diplomatic, but the meaning cut cleanly. We do not defend personalities. We defend the principle that Africans are capable of leading Africans without outside validation. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa received a formal request from 7 West African states to review the implications of international hearings that misrepresent elected or transitional leadership on the continent. The language was restrained, but the intent was not. It culminated in a joint declaration later that week, signed by Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Togo, Benin, and Senegal. No one has the right to choose for us, not through force, not through money, not through shame masked as diplomacy. The declaration was read aloud on national broadcasts across the region, and in Burkina Faso, the reading was met with silence at first, then thunderous applause, then a swell of singing that overtook the main square like a wave. Traoré did not speak that day. He stood behind the podium in military green, hands folded as the people spoke for him, as leaders across borders echoed what many had always felt but never dared say aloud, that Africa's voice had long been shaped by foreign tongues, and now, at last, it spoke for itself. The world watched, some in disbelief, some with discomfort, some with something close to awe, and whether they agreed or not, they could no longer deny one thing. Africa was no longer whispering, it was speaking. 3 days after the hearing imploded, Jasmine Crockett disappeared from Capitol Hill. Her office was closed to the public. The blinds drawn, the phones answered only by interns who had been instructed to say she was on medical leave. But everyone knew. It wasn't illness that kept her away. It was fallout. The ethics committee had moved quickly. A formal review had been opened. The words undisclosed relationships and potential conflicts of interest appeared in official documents. Their language cold, but damning. Press conferences were canceled, invitations rescinded. The television cameras that had once followed her with fascination now watched the door of her empty office with something closer to quiet judgment. She had not spoken since the letter. No press release, no televised rebuttal, only silence. But silence is not absence. It fills space in other ways, in speculation, in memory, and sometimes in voices not meant to be heard. The video came from a hotel security feed, leaked anonymously, recorded without consent, but devoured without hesitation. The internet had already passed its verdict by the time mainstream networks acknowledged it. The footage was grainy, shot from above a private lounge. Crockett sat alone at a table, phone pressed to her ear, her posture tight, her free hand clenched against her thigh. The audio had been enhanced just enough to hear the words clearly. "I thought I was doing the right thing," her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, as if surprised by its own weakness. "You told us to challenge power, to disrupt. I thought I was holding someone accountable." There was a pause, a long one. Only one side of the call was audible. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Holloway, firm but not unkind. "Jasmine, challenging power is not the same as serving it. You know the difference." You've always known. Crockett lowered her head into her hand. The silence between her breasts was more revealing than anything she said. Then softly, she replied, "You were supposed to be proud of me." The call ended there. The video ended there. But the conversation had already left the room. It spilled across social platforms and news feeds, not as another scandal, but as something messier, more human. It was the moment the public stopped seeing Crockett only as the politician with the headlines. They began to see the student again, the daughter, The voice once full of fight, now shaped by doubt. Comment threads changed tone. The mockery gave way to discomfort, then to reflection. What had started as political theater had shifted. The story was no longer just about strategy or exposure. It had become about what happens when ideals collide with ambition, when truth stops being convenient, when someone who believed they were a protagonist begins to suspect they were a proxy. Crockett had been silenced, but not by force, not even by shame. She had been silenced by something quieter, a memory, a voice, a truth she once believed in and had now heard again from the person who first taught her how to believe it all. And in that silence, a different story began to form, not of disgrace, but of reckoning. The heat in Ouagadougou was thick and golden. It clung to the air like memory, coating every surface with light that shimmered through the leaves of mango trees and bounced off the corrugated roofs that stretched toward the horizon. The runway was cracked, sun-baked. Dust rose beneath each step as the plane taxied to a halt, its shadow long and steady across the faded tarmac. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped off the aircraft, he did not wave. He placed one foot on the ground, then the other, his back straight, chin slightly lifted, not in pride, but in quiet recognition of the moment. Around him, a wall of cheers erupted like thunder. Thousands had gathered at the airport. They stood in rows, spilling past the security barriers, clapping and singing and calling his name like it had become part of their breath. Children on shoulders, elders holding flags, youth beating drums that echoed into the city streets beyond. Some held hand-painted signs. Others simply stood with eyes fixed on him. No gesture needed. They had waited, not just for his return, but for what it meant, that after the firestorm abroad, he had come back, not defeated, not defensive, but whole. Traoré walked slowly, flanked only by two security officers who kept their distance. He stopped to shake hands with elders in traditional robes, accepted flowers from a girl who could not have been older than 7, and paused briefly in front of a group of women singing a song that had no beginning and no end, only rhythm. In the heart of the city, cameras waited. At a press gathering hastily arranged outside the presidential office, journalists lined up shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, microphones extended. He took the podium with the same composure he had carried in the hearing, only now. The silence around him was different. It was not wary. It was reverent. One reporter, his voice uncertain beneath the hum of fans overhead, asked the question everyone had come for. "Do you plan to pursue legal action against Congresswoman Crockett?" Traoré let the question hang for a moment. Then he answered, "I do not have time for anger. I do not have time for revenge. What we build here in Burkina Faso cannot grow in the soil of bitterness. Our mission is not to respond to insult. It is to rise above it." He looked out over the crowd, the faces, the cameras, the flags swaying in the afternoon heat. "What matters to me is not what they say over there. What matters is what we do here, what we build, what we protect, what we leave behind." The crowd did not cheer immediately. They listened, let the words settle. Then slowly, a wave of applause moved through them, not loud, not frenzied, but strong, steady. Later that day, as the sun dipped low, Traoré visited a school still under construction on the outskirts of the capital. He spoke with the local architect about using local clay rather than imported materials, asked about the well nearby, touched the wall and tested its strength. There were no photographers, no press releases, just the scrape of brick against calloused hands. The headlines elsewhere continued. Commentators speculated, analysts interpreted. But in Burkina Faso, Traoré's silence in Washington had already become something else. It had become a statement, a refusal to be dragged into the drama of power, a declaration that dignity, once held, does not need to shout, and that real leadership is not proven in the halls of foreign courts, but in the footsteps left behind on dusty roads, where the people walk beside you, not behind. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of the garden outside. Palm fronds brushed gently against the windows, their shadows flickering across the tiled floor in the fading amber light. It was a modest guest house nestled behind the old university library, far from the government buildings and cameras that usually frame such encounters. No aides, no media, no pretense. Professor Margaret Holloway sat at a wooden table, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic cup, untouched. She was older now, slower in her movements, but her mind moved with the same quiet intensity Traoré had remembered from the seminar rooms in Marseille, the same unwavering gaze, behind spectacles slightly smudged with dust and time. Across from her, Traoré sat in silence. He had come alone. They had not spoken in years. Not since the summer course on post-colonial governance, when he was one of 4 students from Francophone West Africa brought into a program meant more for optics than exchange. But Holloway had not taught for the optics. She had seen through the formatting and asked real questions. Questions that stuck long after the lectures ended. She looked at him now, her expression thoughtful, almost cautious. "Why did you not respond in the hearing?" Her voice was soft, but it filled the room. Traoré did not answer immediately. He glanced out the window, where the light of day had begun to stretch long across the courtyard stones. Then he turned back to her. "Because I know what happens when we raise our voices." She waited, sensing more beneath the surface. "I was born into a silence that was enforced, not by law, but by fear. My grandfather never spoke of his land again after it was taken. My mother whispered her prayers because her school taught her another God. And I watched grown men lower their eyes whenever a foreign officer passed." He paused, his voice low and steady. "When I was younger, I thought silence was weakness, that to be strong meant to shout louder than the ones who claim power. But now I understand. Silence is a tool. Sometimes it is a shield. Sometimes it is a statement." He looked directly at her then, not with defiance, but with something deeper, a kind of recognition. "I could have argued, could have exposed their motives, their networks, the hypocrisy. But then I would have played the game on their terms, spoken their language, danced their rhythm, and I will not do that anymore." Holloway exhaled quietly. Her fingers relaxed slightly around the cup. She had spent her life teaching others to speak, to challenge. But now, watching the man in front of her, she saw something else. Not silence as retreat, but silence as refusal, as resistance, and yet it was her voice that had broken the spell in that hearing. "You let me be the one to speak. I knew they would listen to you." She frowned. "Why should they hear me and not you? Because your voice still travels through their gates. Mine never reached them, but yours did. And if the truth must be heard, let it be in the voice they cannot ignore." The words hung in the air. Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves again. The light shifted further, softening the edges of everything it touched. Holloway finally lifted her cup, took a sip, then set it down. "You were always the quiet one, the one who waited until the room was finished shouting before you spoke. Sometimes the room doesn't deserve a reply." She smiled faintly, not with joy, but with something closer to relief, that the student she once knew had not forgotten, that he had not been remade by office or title or the weight of a flag. And in the quiet space between them, no grand declaration was needed. Only the understanding that truth, spoken or unspoken, had found its path. The Grand Hall of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa was solemn, its wide circular architecture echoing every shift in breath. Delegates sat in dignified rows, heads of state aligned in protocol-defined order. But something about the room felt less ceremonial today. There was a waiting undercurrent, not political anticipation, something quieter, more human. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped to the podium, the room did not erupt. It did not fall into a hush. It simply shifted, collectively leaning toward him. Not with applause, but attention. His footsteps were measured, the slight creak of polished shoes on marble audible even beneath the hum of soft air vents and murmured translation devices. He did not wear a suit. He did not bring notes. His uniform was the same as always. Dark olive, modest, clean, familiar. And when he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. We are told that power is proven through strength, that force secures peace. That control brings order. He looked around the room, his gaze brushing over presidents and prime ministers, security ministers, and foreign dignitaries. But strength without truth becomes fear. Force without dignity becomes tyranny. And order without voice becomes silence. And we, the people of Africa, have been silent long enough, a murmur stirred. Not of dissent, but recognition. We cannot win with guns alone. We win with truth, with dignity, and with the courage to stand when the world wants you down. The translation booths lit up. The sentence whispered into headsets in Swahili, Arabic, French, Amharic, Portuguese. The words passed between borders without needing a passport. They called me a problem because I said no, not to peace, not to cooperation, but to exploitation dressed in polite language. I said no to being managed like a file, no to being spoken for like a child. And if that makes me difficult, then let me be difficult with pride. He paused briefly. Africa has many voices, many paths, but one heart. We are not finished. We are not broken. We are not waiting for permission. He stepped back from the podium. No grand flourish, no practiced smile, just stillness. For a full moment, the room remained as it was. No clapping, no rustling, just a silence that carried weight. And then it broke. Not in unison, but in rhythm. One delegate stood, then another, then a third. Applause followed. Not explosive, but deep, resonant, carried from chest to palm like something that had needed to be said for decades and had finally found its voice. By nightfall, the speech was translated and shared across the globe. Shared not as soundbite, but as signal, not as a moment, but as a mark. And those who had once seen Traoré as a man defined by uniform began to see something more. A voice not for himself, but for many who had waited too long to speak. The committee room was half empty when the Ethics Review Board convened. No flashing cameras. No reporters, just the weight of process and the sound of official pages being turned. Jasmine Crockett sat on the far side of a long table, her nameplate polished, her voice absent. 3 weeks had passed since the hearing unraveled. Enough time for alliances to grow quiet, for donors to hesitate, and for political favors to shift elsewhere. She had once walked the Capitol halls with shoulders square and steps sharp. Now she moved differently, not with shame, but with weight. The weight of questions she could no longer answer with sound bites. The investigation moved quickly. The board cited multiple potential conflicts, unreported gifts from advisory consultants, campaign contributions made in close proximity to official statements, and above all, her coordination with industry lobbyists whose interests had direct financial ties to foreign policy narratives. She was stripped from her post on 2 oversight committees. Several major donors withdrew support. At a late-night interview, hosted quietly on a public television channel not known for spectacle, Crockett finally agreed to speak. The studio lights were soft, the setting plain. Just her, a glass of water, and a journalist who did not ask easy questions. You built your platform on speaking truth to power. Do you think you still hold that platform? Crockett's voice broke before the first word could arrive. I used to think fighting meant having the loudest voice in the room. I thought I was doing the right thing. Her hands trembled slightly, folded in her lap. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking why the right thing suddenly needed strategy. I stopped noticing when my instincts became calculations. The journalist did not interrupt. And then, almost in a whisper, she said it. I became what I used to stand against. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it. The camera caught it all. That clip was shared more than any other part of the hearing. Not because it was scandalous, but because it felt honest. And for a moment, Politics gave way to something far more human, a person breaking and maybe beginning again. The leak was not loud. It did not explode onto the front page. It arrived quietly, like most dangerous things. A bundle of documents sent anonymously to a journalist at a European investigative consortium. Dozens of email threads between Crockett's office and Northstone International, a private extractive consortium with projects halted under Traoré's administration. The tone of the emails was casual, friendly, a little too familiar. Lunch next week with regional envoy. Pushing Burkina angle. We'll prep the talking points. Can we align language with the security narrative? The board's concerned the sovereignty frame won't stick. The most damning were internal memos between the lobbying team and Northstone's legal counsel. Phrases like political influence package and behavioral nudges showed a campaign long in the making, aimed at framing African resistance as instability and marketing foreign pressure as moral diplomacy. Once published, the documents spread fast. In Nairobi, students protested outside a regional embassy. In Dakar, artists painted murals condemning corporate interference masked as aid. The online campaign Stop Exploiting Africa launched within days, fueled by influencers, activists, and former diplomats. The movement was decentralized but swift. It wasn't just about Crockett anymore. It was about something older and wider, how narratives are shaped, how wealth travels, and how power never arrives empty-handed. Talk shows in the United States debated the role of lobbying in foreign policy. Former intelligence officials squirmed on camera. Public opinion, once comfortable with simple categories, now grappled with uncomfortable questions. The political fallout spread to think tanks, policy roundtables, even congressional hearings far removed from Burkina Faso. And for the first time in years, the question of Africa's right to say no was not just rhetorical, it was urgent, and someone, finally, was listening. The auditorium was modest, old wood, worn carpets, and a stage that had seen more philosophers than politicians. It was the annual International Human Rights Colloquium in Geneva, known more for its depth than its headlines. Yet this year, cameras lined the back wall, not because of who was attending, but because of who was being honored. Professor Margaret Holloway, recipient of the Global Voice for Conscience Award. She stood at the podium without notes, a single page folded neatly in her jacket pocket, untouched. Her voice was clear, without ornament. I once thought my job was to teach a murmur move through the crowd. She let it settle. To teach means to explain, to clarify, to structure thought. For decades, I believed that was enough. She paused, then looked out at the rows of scholars, students, diplomats. But in recent years, I have learned something else. Sometimes teaching is not about knowledge. Sometimes it is about interruption. To remind the powerful what it means to be human. To remind the ambitious what it means to be accountable. And to remind ourselves that truth does not always arrive when it is welcome. It arrives when it must. The applause was slow at first. Then rising, I do not regret speaking up. I regret waiting. She stepped back, not with triumph, but with grace. In the days that followed, her words were reprinted, quoted, and shared. Her letter was added to university syllabi. One sentence was painted across a wall at a university in Accra. Truth does not always arrive when it is welcome. It arrives when it must, and somewhere in a quiet apartment in Washington, a former congresswoman watched the speech alone, not with resentment, not with grief, but with understanding. The professor had never raised her voice. She had simply raised the standard. The classroom was small, painted in sun-worn colors. Desks were chipped, but the children sat proudly. They had heard the stories. Some had watched the hearing on an old projector. Others had listened on the radio with their parents. Now, Traoré stood before them, not with guards, not with speeches, just himself. He spoke softly, not like a leader, but like an uncle with something important to share. Truth is not loud, he said. It does not beg to be believed. It waits. He told them about doubt, about moments where silence feels like safety, but also how silence can be a choice, not of fear, but of strength. A girl raised her hand. Were you scared when the whole world turned against you? He smiled, slowly. If the truth ever scares you, then you have not yet felt its strength. The class fell quiet. It was not the kind of silence that follows confusion, but the kind that follows understanding. Once, long before the hearing and headlines, there was a student in the back row of a French lecture hall, Ibrahim Traoré, silent, attentive, always watching. He rarely raised his hand, but when he did, the room stilled. Holloway had seen something in him even then, a steadiness, a fire not made of noise, but depth. At the same time, in another part of the world, Jasmine Crockett paced across her campus, her voice sharp, her eyes full of fight. She led debates, signed petitions, challenged professors. She wanted change. She just didn't yet know how easily purpose could be purchased. Two paths, same teacher, same foundation, but choices built the difference. Traoré held on to the weight of truth, even when it meant walking alone. Crockett let others hand her a script and called it conviction. In the end, one stood tall. The other fell not because she was weak, but because she forgot why she rose in the first place. In a quiet closing scene, Traoré sat before a group of youth leaders from across West Africa. There was no official title for this gathering, no cameras, just a question on the table. What does leadership mean now? He looked at them, then answered with no hesitation. The world does not need perfect heroes. It needs people brave enough to stand when everyone else sits. His words were not loud, but they stayed. Later that night, alone in his study, he reread Holloway's letter one last time, not to remember the hearing, but to remind himself of something deeper. Truth never needed to be defended by noise. It only needed people willing to carry it forward. And then, as if speaking to no one in particular, he whispered, "You might not lead a country, but when the time comes to speak truth in your own world, will you dare stand up outside?" The wind moved quietly through the trees. And the story, though ended, had just begun for someone else. There are moments in history that do not erupt with noise, but rather unfold in silence, and yet leave echoes that last for generations. The story of Ibrahim Traoré facing a storm of political pressure inside the United States Congress is one of those moments. Here was a man, a leader from a small West African nation, brought into the spotlight under the weight of accusations, assumptions, and geopolitical tension. The narrative was already shaped before he entered the room. Many expected him to defend, to plead, or to fall. But instead, he remained still. In an age of endless shouting, where power is often confused with volume, Traoré's silence spoke louder than anything else in the room. He didn't fight back with anger. He didn't trade insults. He allowed the truth and the unexpected voice of a respected professor to carry the weight of what needed to be said. And somehow, that quiet choice carried more power than any scripted rebuttal ever could. At the heart of this story is something universal: the courage to hold your ground when the world tells you to sit down, the restraint to choose dignity over drama, and perhaps most importantly, the clarity to remember why you started when others lose their way. Jasmine Crockett, too, is part of that lesson. Once an idealist, she was swept into a current of influence and power that often blurs right and wrong. Her fall was not simply political, it was personal, and yet, in her pain and public reckoning, there was something deeply human. The realization that even when we lose ourselves, there's always a way back, if we're willing to face the truth. This story, while wrapped in politics, touches something far beyond institutions. It's about integrity, about the thin line between using your voice to uplift or to suppress, about how systems can fail, but individuals can choose not to. In the end, Traoré's greatest act wasn't out shouting his opponent, it was holding still, allowing the truth to arrive not with force, but with weight. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. Perhaps what makes this story so moving is that it reminds us, you don't need a title to stand up. You don't need a spotlight to do what's right. Sometimes, all you need is the courage to speak, or not speak, when it matters most. So here's a question for you, wherever you are, whoever you are, when the moment comes to speak, to stand, or to stay true, will you be ready? Because the world doesn't just change through noise. It changes when people like you decide that truth is worth the cost. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.